Hi, my name is Casper René Johansen and I'm your YouTube philosopher. This video here is about 5 of my favorite philosophers of all time. This was actually a big challenge for me to pick 5 philosophers, only 5 philosophers, because I like so many different kind of philosophers. So to narrow it down to only 5 was actually a pretty good challenge. I have some paintings or illustration of actually 6 kind of philosophers. It's just something I have in my hallway. By having these illustrations, I admit that Immanuel Kant is not one of the 5 favorite philosophers. I like Immanuel Kant, but he's not one of my favorite philosophers. But I have him on the wall because I like Immanuel Kant. Now you have to understand that this list is not in order of the best to the number 5. It's not a ranked list, so to speak. It's just 5 of my favorite philosophers. It's even harder, I think, to say who's the best of these. It's just 5 philosophers I really like. The first philosopher on this list is Alfred North Whitehead, who wrote Process and Reality. And it shouldn't come to any great surprise that Alfred North Whitehead is on my list, because, as it says on my t-shirt, process philosophy, and he's the guy who labeled or he's the guy behind process philosophy. And by admitting that I like Alfred North Whitehead and he's one of my favorite philosophers, I'm admitting that I like Heraclitus, because Alfred North Whitehead, he bases his philosophy on Heraclitus' Pantare, everything flows, right? That everything changes, which is the whole process philosophy thing. I made 2 videos about process philosophy, and I really like process philosophy because it admits that everything changes, and this is important, that everything changes. All things in the universe changes, and there's a permeance of change all over. Even in physics, things change, and a particle is at one point a solid particle, but it's also a wave. It changes its appearances, its function. There's change all over. So I really like this process philosophy, and that in order to philosophize you have to have a processual terminology, a processual argumentation, and there's no result you can get to that will not change a bit over time, to kind of being modified over time. That's the idea of process philosophy. I'm rambling on about process philosophy, but that's because, one second, that Alfred North Whitehead is one of my 5 favorite philosophers. Now my next philosopher, number 2, is Plato. And it's funny, because my first philosopher was Alfred North Whitehead, and he's the one who's famous for being the one who said that all philosophy is just footnotes to Plato's philosophy. So, also, of course, I like Plato. He's one of my favorite philosophers, because I agree with Whitehead that there's so much wealth in the ideas of Plato. He comes into so much philosophy and philosophical ideas that's overwhelming. And even today, when you read Plato, you cannot find a modern philosophy that he hasn't in some sort touched back in ancient Greece. And he is really one of the best philosophers of all time, I think. And one should start with reading one's Plato. And by saying that Plato is one of my favorite philosophers. I'm also admitting that Socrates is one of my favorite philosophers, because most of what we know from Socrates comes mostly from Plato, and Plato's view on who Socrates was. So of course I like Socrates, of course. And the reason why I also like Plato, other than his world of philosophical ideas that spread out through his works, is also what it means to be a philosopher, which come through his dialogues. You really get a good understanding on what it's like to be a philosopher. I have a picture here of Plato. Here he's next to his pupil Aristotle, in this from the school of Athens. But this is Plato right here. But I really dig the way that Plato here understands what it means to be a philosopher, and the journey of the philosopher that comes through this the allegory of the cave. That's one of my favorite things about Plato's philosophy, the whole allegory of the cave, which I think is one of the most important and interesting allegory in the whole history of philosophy. And I get really still, I understand new depths of this allegory of the cave still to this day. So of course Plato's on this list. The next one on this list might surprise somebody out there, that I have this guy, this philosopher on this list, because he's one of the existentialists. And why did I choose him over so many good existential thinkers? But my number 3 on this list, and remember they're not ranked because who's best, it's just 5 of my favorite philosophers. But number 3 on the list is this guy, Jean-Paul Sartre. Jean-Paul Sartre. And he's on this list because he's actually my favorite proponent of existentialism. And some might be surprised of that because he's so mainstream. I like Sartre because he's actually the one who comes across as an existentialist in the most understandable way. He makes it most understandable. You really get the position of existentialism through Sartre's writings and Sartre's understanding of the whole existential idea. And he's also the guy who labeled it existentialism. But take the other existentialists like Kierkegaard and Friedrich Nietzsche. I like their philosophy. Of course I like them. I like Kierkegaard. Here's Nietzsche. Of course I like Nietzsche and his philosophy. I made videos about Nietzsche's philosophy. I also made video about Kierkegaard's philosophy. So of course I like them. But as an existentialist, I kind of best like Sartre, because Kierkegaard, he becomes too religious. And Nietzsche, he's too rebellious for me in the long run. He gets too anarchistic and rebellious for the sake of rebellion itself, I think. So I like Sartre because he has room for ethics, and he has the most strong position in existentialist that you really can understand and relate to as a modern man. And he's also one of the most modern proponent of this existential thinking. So that's why I really like Sartre the best of these existentialists. But also because he has room for one ethical idea, or other ethical ideas also, but the ethical idea that you can do almost anything with your life as long as you don't try to destroy other people's life projects. If you don't hurt their life projects in some way, it's okay, everything you do. So that's the only thing for Sartre you really have to worry about. Do my project ruin other people's project? And that's existential ethics that I kind of like. Another existentialist that's on this wall is also Martin Heidegger. He's also regarded as an existential thinker. And I also like Heidegger's philosophy, but he's not one of my favorites philosophers, and that's kind of also because who he was as a person. He was member of the Nazi Party. I forgot Jean-Paul Sartre is also on this wall. He's right here in his study. Look at that. That's Jean-Paul Sartre. So now my fourth philosopher, and remember these are not ranked philosophers. It's just 5 of my favorite philosophers. But number 4 on this list is, we have to go back to ancient Greece. It's the one standing between Plato here. It's his pupil, Aristotle. Here he is, Aristotle. And he's one of my 5 favorite philosophers also, because he was such an extreme genius of his time, and the wealth of his understanding of the world, and his well, he's also a kind of a father to modern science in the way, and he starts many of these fields within science or scientific thinking, and he goes around doing all kinds of scientific kind of a thing back in ancient Greece. He's also the one who started putting these animals into families and categories, and such a genius. But the reason why I love Aristotle's philosophy is actually not because of his metaphysics that much. Of course, it's a great metaphysics of his time, and there's a wealth of idea in his metaphysics. But it's not the favorite thing. The reason why I like Aristotle is actually his ethical philosophy and his views on the political thinking of his time and even modern times. I like the whole that we are political animals. I like the whole idea of that, but also his philosophy of virtue. I like all that virtue philosophy, and something that's very dear to me, using virtue ethics. And he was the one who kind of started that. So I really like that about Aristotle. I kind of think I should read more Aristotle. I haven't read all Aristotle's work. I would like to do that at one point through my life, to read all that Aristotle has ever written. So I'm gonna do that one day, read everything. But also a thing I really like about Aristotle is the golden middle way, that one should never be too extreme in one direction or another. You should always strive towards the middle, at the point between two extremes, the middle point between two extremes, in philosophy and in the way you live your life, in ethics, in everything. And that's what I really like also about Aristotle, is his whole idea of the golden middle way. That's very special for me. Now the last philosopher on this list of my 5 favorite philosophers is actually kind of a anti-philosopher, which I think is important to have on this list, because I had to narrow 5 philosophers down amongst the many philosophers I like. I had to narrow it down to 5, so I think it was important to have a kind of opposite to all the other philosophers, an anti-philosopher, to get that philosophy across that I also like, and that is Diogenes. The Diogenes, he didn't write anything, and his philosophy was his way of living as a cynic on the street with his barrel that he moved around, living in this barrel or tub that he lived in. So I really like Diogenes, and I also made videos about Diogenes' philosophy and silent movies about the legends, the great stories about Diogenes. That's something I really like, these stories, legends about Diogenes, because they really tell something about how he viewed life. By admitting that I like Diogenes, I also admit that I like other cynics, like Antisthenes. Antisthenes, his teacher, and who wrote philosophy himself. And I also like the whole cynical movement. And of course I also like Stoicism then. And of course I also like skepticism then, when I say I like Diogenes. But I have Diogenes on this list because he's the ultimate rebel philosopher, the original dog, the original philosopher, rebel philosopher, who really, one of the only philosophers I really know of who really lived their philosophy. If he was real, that's also the exciting thing about Diogenes. This is just a legend. Was there really such a man? Or was he really like so and so? Or was it stories made up about him? But I think his idea is still relevant today. The whole cynical idea about us not living out our true nature, and we're not really as logical or rational as we like to think, and our whole intellectualization of everything, and our whole civilized making of things is pure horseshit and nonsense in some way. And that's the whole idea of Diogenes. He's still a challenge to an intellectual thinker like me, that he's kind of still saying it's horseshit. You should live like your true nature. You shouldn't be explaining to yourself that you are so and so, and you are so intellectual, and you're so civilized and all that. He still provoked me after all these years since I started reading philosophy and read the stories about Diogenes. He still provoked me. So that's why he's on this list, because I still find his movement, his cynical movement, I still find it very relevant today in my life and in society. So he's on the list. Who's this guy down here that I haven't mentioned, who's on my wall? Is he one of my favorite philosophers? Yes, he's one of my favorite philosophers, but I had to narrow it down to only 5 philosophers. Not 6, 5. That was the challenge that I gave myself, only to pick 5 philosophers, not 6. But here he is. Of course I like Hegel and his philosophy. I like Hegel. So that's why he's on my wall, because I think Hegel is an important thinker, and I really like a lot of his philosophy. But I had to pick between him and Alfred Whitehead if I had to do something. And for me, Hegel is also a process thinker. So I think by saying that I like Alfred Whitehead and process philosophy, I'm also saying I like Hegel. I hope you like this video about 5 of my favorite philosophers. So I hope to see you in my next video. Bye.